online. And thank you all for joining us in person. This is, I've lost track. I believe this is the second event of the spring 2024 Iranian Studies Initiative series. I'm very excited to have some colleagues that I'll introduce in a moment. But let me just give you an announcement regarding an event that's, we have a kind of a busy April. We have several events in April, so please keep track. But the most immediate one is on Thursday, April 4th. Here in the same room. It's going to, again, be in person as well as on Zoom. This will be a book talk by our own or our former student, Bashur, a graduate of the PhD program in anthropology, as well as her colleague Vali Nasr, on their recently published book titled How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. Again, that's Thursday, April 4th. And I will just encourage you to follow the Kevorkian Twitter and Instagram pages for other events. I do believe 2 more other events for April of this academic year. I should have introduced myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Iranian Kurdistan. I'm a faculty here in the Department of Middle East and Islamic Studies, as well as a member of the Iranian Studies Initiative Steering Committee. It's a pleasure to introduce you to a great, a wonderful anthropologist, Moslem Ghomashlouyan, who is with us here for this academic year. Moslem is actually a PhD student at the Institute of Social Anthropology at the University of Bern in Switzerland, but he is currently a visiting research fellow in the Department of Middle East and Islamic Studies here. As you will learn about this evening, Moslem has done original field research in Iran in various places, but most centrally on the Iranian Kurdistan region or Rojhelat. His project explores contraband commerce, migration, and gender in a border village in Iranian Kurdistan. But as you'll learn today, the project extends to various other places, not only in Iran, but well beyond its borders. Moslem completed an MA in sociology and social anthropology at the Central European University, and before that he studied sociology at the University of Tehran. So the plan is that Moslem will take about 30 minutes to present his research, and then we are lucky enough to have a wonderful discussant from up the street, an assistant professor of anthropology at Columbia, Nawar Ben Yehuda, whose research directly connects with Moslem's research interest. Professor Ben Yehuda's research focuses on unauthorized migration, criminal justice, and the aftermath of development and transnational political imaginaries in the central and eastern Mediterranean. He's the author of many articles, and most importantly, a book, a monograph titled The Mediterranean Incarnate, Transnational Region Formation Between Sicily and Tunisia Since World War II. This was published by University of Chicago Press. And it offers a historical anthropology of the recent reemergence of the Mediterranean. He specifically is interested in the process through which transnational regions form and dissipate. He is currently involved in a number of different projects, including one exploring debates around the mafia and how anti-mafia forms of inquiry by magistrates, journalists, so political activists, and police investigators encounter the question of the mafia. Professor Ben Yehuda holds a PhD in social anthropology from Harvard and an MA in sociology and anthropology from Tel Aviv University. So after Moslem's presentation, we will turn for comments from Anwar, and then I will also present 5 to 8 minutes of comments, and then we'll have plenty of time for your own questions and feedback. So Without further ado, the floor is all yours.
All right, thank you very much. I also want to thank Ali and Orang and the Iranian Studies Initiative for letting me, for this opportunity to present my research to you, and also Noor for reading the chapter and being here, and also the participants and the folks on the Zoom. So this is work in progress. I'm still writing up my PhD research. This is the third chapter. So I look forward to your comments. Let me start in Tehran, the place that has been the focus of many ethnographies of Iran. In their apartment in Shahrak Mahallati, poised on the upscale eastern fringe of North Tehran, Homa's family exemplified the societal segment that evolved during the post-1979 era in Iran. Her father's role as a university professor and her mom's as a school principal placed them within the new middle and upper classes of Tehran. As the only daughter of her parents who did not immigrate to Europe, Homa lived on the first floor of her parents' four-story apartment building on the western edge of North Tehran. During my fieldwork, I was based in a border village in Rojhelat, or Iranian Kurdistan, that I simply call the village for now, for reasons of anonymity. However, her apartment was one of my hangouts whenever I stayed in Tehran between June 2021 and June 2022. Visiting her in that year usually included spending a few hours in the nearby shopping malls. I alternated between engaging the store owners in conversations about their products and the friendship responsibility of assisting Homa in making decisions by providing input. The first time we did that, we went to Bomland shopping mall by the Chitgar Lake in northwestern Tehran. Homa needed running gear since she had decided to join a group of men and women running every day around the Chitgar Lake early in the morning. The last stop was a rather big athletic apparel store outside the shopping mall. Named after a large sportswear manufacturer in Europe, which no longer did business in Iran, they sold items from Nike, New Balance, Adidas, Reebok, and the like. I believe I ended up offending one of the co-owners of the store who was present that afternoon when I asked if their products were secondhand while holding a sneaker in my hand. I apologized and mentioned that in Kurdistan, the retailers sold sneakers, both secondhand and otherwise. He pointed out that I could visit Junub Shahr, South Tehran, if I was interested in secondhand products. I could only surmise what could have happened if I asked him if they sold any knockoffs. But interestingly, he had no problem revealing his products came via different contraband or qachab routes. This is not the store, it's another one. I imagine that their customers did not doubt that they sold original items, pronounced original, even though it was no secret that those sporting manufacturers had cut ties with Iran so as not to jeopardize their operations in the United States. I told Homa I could show her places in Kurdistan that would sell her sneakers like those at 1/3 of that price if she visited me in Kurdistan. She later did, so did 3 other friends and my family. But why did not more of his customers ask him those kinds of questions? They must have been aware of the measures designed to sever the country's ties with global markets, exemplified by Adidas refusing to provide the Iran national football team with jerseys in 2018 ahead of the Asian Cup in order to avoid facing penalties by the United States. It became big news in Iran. The store co-owner could not import his products through official ports of entry either. Then what kind of meandering paths and logistical networks did retailers like him have to resort to in order to provide their customers with those brand name goods that they used to enjoy before the sanctions? By taking the mobility of contraband that travels inside Iran as my vantage point, I want to discuss entangled connectivities and disconnectivities that contraband chain represents. First, despite sanctions aiming to isolate Iran from global markets, the contraband chains showcase the country's ongoing connection to the global trade. This occurs even as Iran promotes resistance economy since 2012 to counter economic sanctions. The Iranian rhetorical quest for a resistance economy proposes economic nationalism and minimum reliance on foreign resources of any kind, especially from the West, and promotes material autarky, as Rudi Mate shows. However, the sanctions against Iran contributed to reinforcement of regional connectivities in that geography despite those efforts. But instead of challenging the conventional belief of an isolated Iran by focusing on countries' formal trade, as others have done, for example, the study of Iran under sanctions, I focus on informal commercial mobilities, like the research project that Emre Yield is currently undertaking. I also want to show glimpses of a connected and disconnected quote-unquote nation. The contraband consumer commodities connect the center and periphery in Iran. In this case, Rojhelat, which is home to the minoritized Kurdish people, to the wealthier areas of North Tehran. But the connection is concealing the ethnically entrenched socioeconomic inequalities that disconnect the two. Even though contraband mobility is possible in part, if not entirely, because of high inequality in income, capital, education, jobs, and credit between my interlocutors in Rojhelat and the residents of North Tehran. The Kurdish borderlanders play a central role in cross-border contraband mobility. Those with less access to capital and credit perform the grueling and dangerous menial job of moving the contraband across the border. They are known as kolbers. The other group of actors I want to introduce here are retailers in Kurdish cities who have more access to capital and credit than kolbers. Those retailers sell the products that kolbers carry inside Iran, but sometimes they also provide their counterparts in Tehran with merchandise. Many urban merchants in Iran have managed to sustain their enterprises amid sanctions thanks to those mobilities. The cross-border mobility of goods also provides a livelihood and supposedly a chance for social mobility for numerous intermediaries and border workers. Nonetheless, despite the financial gains for all the parties involved, the work of kolbers crossing borders remains arduous and perilous. Depending on whom you ask, it is estimated that between 40 to 500,000 Iranian Kurds are involved in cross-border contraband mobility, bringing a variety of consumer goods into Iran. In the closest urban hub to the village, the place that I simply call here the city, I was put in contact with Aram, a young man in his late 30s. Aram runs a store selling brand name outdoor mountaineering gear and sneakers. None of the city retailers that I talked to, including Aram, sold knockoffs. They sold new and secondhand brand name items. Most of Aram's profit margin came from providing his counterparts in Tehran with contraband turned merchandise, where the brand name merchandise not only embodied quality and higher production standards, but was also one of the only ways to show one's status. With the record high increase in oil revenue flowing into the country in the 2000s, a new post-revolutionary upwardly mobile middle class, Iran saw this boom in consumption in the 2000s. The upstart Iranians leveraged decades of developmental and social welfare policies of the Iranian state, aspiring to a lifestyle characterized by opulence and status, where consumption emerged as a key indicator of social standing. Tehran and other major Iranian cities saw a rise in a new class of Iranians demanding more consumer commodities. Come 2006, however, the sanction regime started a program that ultimately subjected Iran to a sky's the limit sanctions package. It has been said that the main aim of the sanctions has been to inflict pain by isolating Iran diplomatically and economically, and to disrupt the sense of normalcy in Iran's economic activities. It was also at that time that multinational companies, including some of those companies selling popular sneakers, started to cut ties with Iran. In turn, contraband commerce in Kurdistan rose to unprecedented levels in the village and elsewhere. There was a good deal of permissiveness from the Iranian border guards regarding those activities in the Iran-Iraq border region. They seemed uninterested in stopping the flow. Therefore, it could serve the Iranian households, including the top 5%, whose purchasing power was not substantially affected by the sanctions, and by 2020, for example, accounted for 35% of total household expenditures in the country. Not only was Not only was there an exodus of companies out of Iran after the sanctions, but also they and major foreign retailers who would trade their merchandise with Iranian merchants did not want to accept payments originating from Iran. Higher import duties were also introduced by the Iranian government, justified by the rhetoric of resistance economy. Finally, a 2019 law through which the Iranian government prohibited the entry of goods with similar domestic counterparts made cross-border informal trade even more salient. All of these developments meant that it would be more straightforward and cheaper to import items like those sneakers that I was holding in my hand in the summer of 2021 via contraband routes that account for almost 1/3 of the country's imports. Of course, the Kurdish route is only one among many other contraband circuits in Iran. Others include the country's southern shores, colloquially known as Tahlenji smuggling, contraband routes in Baluchistan in the southeast of the country, and the practice known as suitcase trade via flights from Turkey. All those contraband routes serve to redirect and reroute the disrupted mobility of the formal supply chains into the country in the age of sanctions. She's a rapper, an Iranian rapper. Contraband trade in the village and the city is organized, at least in the clothing and footwear sector, by networks sustained through long-term personal connections between mostly, if not entirely, men. Based on my ethnographic learning experience, when retailers in major Kurdish cities, Tehran or other Iranian cities want to have those products through contraband routes of Kurdistan, they either need to know or find a middle person in a Kurdish border village or town. Those middle persons hire kolbers for the job and guarantee the safe passage of those products across the border. Those Kurdish middle persons, called sahibars, are the only ones occasionally referred to as smugglers. The word sahibar translates to load or cargo owner. Nevertheless, they do not own the cargo. They hire kolbers and coordinate the transport of the cargo from pickup points in Bashur to Rojhelat for a fee. Like most frontier dwellers, Aram has extended family straddling the border. The cross-border connections that Aram benefits from, irrespective of the sanctions on Iran, prove advantages for this trade. Since Iranian banks cannot send or receive payments through the global SWIFT system, for the most part, payments need to go through trust-based system that fall outside the jurisdiction of the international banking system. Aram has a cousin who has long been working as a retailer in the same sector in the city of Hawler, Erbil in Bashur. Goods sent from Europe for Aram's store must be rerouted to his cousin. It is the cousin's job to order those items for his store, Aram's or perhaps other retailers in Rojhelat. What they need is the unsold inventories of sneakers or second-hand ones. Even for many residents of uptown Tehran, it is not always affordable to buy the latest release of brand name sneakers because of the back-to-back episodes of currency devaluation in Iran since 2012. Unsold inventories originating from Europe become cheaper alternatives. But no matter what, Aram's cousin still needs to be compensated for his payments. He gets paid through the system of honor and trust, the honor and trust-based system of Hawale. Hawale is essentially a money order that is processed partly outside the banking systems. It is a promise to pay a third party with whom one has a business relation. Those who do this task are currency traders known as sarrafs in Iran. Aram's sarraf in Rojhelat receives Iranian currency from him. He in turn orders his sarraf partner in Bashur to pay Aram's cousin on his behalf in US dollars. But in order to keep the prices competitive, Aram never relied exclusively on his licensed sarraf or his cousin to reroute his merchandise to Bashur, since he knew a few other former residents of Rojhelat doing business in Bashur who would help him for a fee. Let me share with you an exchange I had with a retailer in North Tehran, which points to the critical role someone like Aram plays. Named after a US-based sports manufacturer, his sneaker store was located in a very high-end shopping mall. Because of all the hoops that he had to jump through to stock brand name sneakers, Not a single pair of sneakers in his store was priced below the national monthly minimum wage. His prices were significantly higher than what they would be in Western Europe, even though he was selling mostly models no longer available in European outlets. So naturally, I questioned him about profitability, to which he confidently replied, "Why would I bother if I couldn't make a profit?" He was also ready to brush off my inquiries about the efficacy of the government's policies that aimed at pushing for an economy based on self-reliance. He came up with his own state theory. To articulate the government's navigation of the sanctions aftermath, he chose an idiom with a colorful language, which I would translate as the Iranian government flying by the seat of its pants. The Iranian ban on foreign goods was toothless, in his opinion. He conceptualized the ban in the categorization of favors. It was supposed to silence the Iranian capitalist class, but regular international trade in Iran was already becoming more and more impossible before that ban. Also Kurdish commercial activities and letting contraband pass through the border mountains of Kurdistan stood in contrast to that legislation. Nevertheless, it favored the urban middle and upper classes so that they could get their hands on what they wanted. He believed he could get his merchandise past Iranian customs in the southern ports of Iran only if he could take the money out of Iran to pay for them. His problem was transferring money and not the Iranian policymakers' lauded push for a resistance economy. Theoretically, though, Tehrani retailers could also use the system of Hawala. However, it was not straightforward for them. Even though the Hawala system works based on trust, the currency traders who draft money orders still need to balance themselves, and their debts need to be canceled out. There needs to be an inflow of hard currency into Iran from different countries, but there isn't. And it was more straightforward in Rojhelat with the help of sidewalk sarrafs. They operate a few hundred meters from Aram's store in the city. They take advantage of their proximity to the border and the visa-free regime between Iran and the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq, and shuttle hard currencies to and from Bashur for different people. The connectivities that Kurdish actors involved in the contraband chain embody let us see it as a form of regional territoriality, fostered by the redirection of formal supply chains. It competes with state-sponsored territorialization and its emphasis on quote-unquote national economy, the sanctity of borders, and territorial integrity. But state-sponsored territorialization of Iran remains influential in the realm of the so-called national imagination. It stands at odds with the border control practices of state functionaries in Kurdistan that practically fuel a rescaling of the state and look away from Kurdish contraband networks and mobilities. State territoriality feeds from a concept of Iran as a cohesive entity. This concept, as Zia Ibrahimi writes, forms the foundation of the Iranian nationalism many in Iran and diasporic circles embrace. This view sees Iran as a community composed of primarily a few united ethnic groups rather than distinct nations. However, the entangled connectivities and disconnectivities of North Tehran and Rojhelat show where the conditions of possibility reside when this national imagination is being problematized. Even though those connectivities and disconnectivities benefit many Tehrani subjects who may or may not share that national imagination. When a couple of my friends came to visit me for Nowruz holidays in the village, I asked Voria, whom I wrote about in a previous chapter, to accompany me as I picked them up midway from their journey from the airport to the village. On our way back, when my friends realized that Voria, with 21 years of age, did kolbari for a living, they became very interested. They asked him questions like if his job was difficult, and Voria gave them long, detailed responses. He also mentioned all the injuries he had sustained throughout 6 years on the job without the effective discharges on the part of my friends that Voria may or may not have hoped for after finishing his long responses. Throughout the few days that my friends stayed in Rojhelat, we went to the city for shoe shopping, among other things. and there never came another time for them to see Warrior. They each bought a couple of pairs of sneakers from the city retailers. Incidentally, a couple of weeks later, Warrior and I went to the city together since he wanted to do shoe shopping. But he did his shopping from a vendor with his shoes spread out not so far from where my friends bought their shoes. He bought a pair of Adidas knockoffs for about 1/10 of the price of the original versions sold in the sneaker shops, including Aram's. On our way back from the city, I asked Warrior why he didn't treat himself to a pair of more pricey sneakers. Referring to his detailed plan for his life, he said, "I cannot spend money like that. I'm saving money to build my house and open a shop and propose to my love." He had more than enough cash in his pocket to pay for the same shoes my friends bought. However, even though how he dressed up and looked was of utmost importance to him, spending money on brand name shoes would set him back from his course toward his plans that involved getting out of doing Coolberry. He needed to save money to start a small business and settle down, or as he eventually attempted to, pay for the journey without documents across European borders, like 300 to 400 other young men from the village who had gone through that journey before him. I had not planned on focusing on sneakers in one way or the other, even though I had lived a good part of my adult life in Tehran. I was pretty ignorant about their significance in the Iranian context before my fieldwork, perhaps because neither I nor my family had ever lived in North Tehran. I got asked about the price of the attire I possessed during my fieldwork, but none of them got the attention of people in the village and Tehran more than the pair of white Adidas Superstars I wore that year. Something like that. They are known among many in Iran as Adidas Sekhat, Adidas 3 lines, referring to the 3 strips on the model. When I bought a pair of them in Switzerland in 2020, little did I know that they would catch the attention of many. The perception of the other upper and middle classes of Tehran, the perception the upper and middle classes of Tehran have about themselves as being quote unquote global, as opposed to the rest of the country that is quote unquote traditional and local, is being partly reconstructed through Kurdish transnational connections. Those connections supply the Tehranis with items necessary for upholding the quote unquote status division that Shahram Khosravi writes about in his 2008 book. Those items are out of reach for someone like Warrior, even though for him too, it is important to possess original brand names. The youth both in uptown Tehran and the village indeed desire to consumer brand name goods. However, the difference was that in the village, for the most part, they only talked about foreign brand names, even though many took part in providing Iranians with those products. The so-called imagination of consumption that Khosravi writes about in the context of Tehran, meaning looking at consumer commodities, imagining their consumption and talking about them, could be attributed to both groups. However, only one group could in fact actualize that imagination. The price of those sneakers goes up as they hurtle through different dots in the contraband chain, but they also gain exponential value as markers of status. In a sanctioned Iran, they are rare and unusually expensive. What adds value to those sneakers is partly the decay and ruination of kolbers' bodies, the invisible labor of their mothers and wives, and a sense of sexual anxiety in the kolbers' families. The kolbers must also brave the occasional shootings of the Iranian border guards. Let me share one last story from the village. On my way home, I came across 4 friends enjoying the late sunlight of an early May evening. They were sitting on a staircase that tied the tiered village. They invited me over and I joined their company. They were married men with kids, all working as kolbers, with 3 in their late 20s and 1 approaching 40. I first responded to their inquiries about why, as opposed to the usual pantols or Kurdish baggy pants I wore in the village, I was wearing jeans that they called Farsi pants. I was told yet again that my white Adidas Superstars looked better with my black pantols. After sitting with them, I asked Kamyar why I had not seen him going to the border for Coolberry in a while. My question led to his admission of returning back pain, which I hadn't known about before. His revelation took a deeper turn when he confided about struggling with erection issues, a topic whispered about but never personally shared with me. I was used to people talking about other people's sex life, potency, etc., but no one had ever said that about himself. The weight of his disclosure silenced us. What Kamyar shared felt significant to me, not only because it was the first time someone admitted that about himself. It was also significant because it was one of the rare moments that, for a change, it was not my masculinity that was being a point of discussion. My body became a point of discussion, usually in contrast with kolbers' bodies. Taking pride in their resilient bodies was an implicit and often explicit reminder to me that a city boy like me could never do what they did. I never did kolbari myself, but the point is that it took months for Kamyar to be the first one to confide with me that kolbari was decaying his body like that. It is not hard to imagine that kolbars lose their body capacities after years of going up and down the mountains carrying contraband. But in the meantime, the Iranian global subjects remain connected to the world. I asked what we can learn about the incorporation of Kurdish contraband commerce in the economies of Iran as an imagined nation. What connected and disconnected the people who appeared here was the simple fact that it was the inequalities between the two groups that pushed people like Woria and Kamyar to lace up their knockoff Adidas shoes and traverse the mountains, adding value to the perceived status of others at the expense of the ruination of their bodies, the happiness of their families, etc. This is what Anat Singh would call interconnection across difference. She argues that the connections between the actors in the global flows need to be uneven to be possible. It is precisely the better wages of an informal job in Kurdistan with a population that is deprived of any other means of subsistence that push them to take part in this contraband chain. She uses the metaphor of friction. I quote, "A wheel turns because of its encounter with the surface of the road. Spinning it in the air, it goes nowhere. Rubbing two sticks together produces heat and light. One stick alone is just a stick. The friction of the wheel and the road is not just about slowing down the speed. It also makes the motion possible in the first place. But some things are ruined along the way of this process. It is not simply a moral or political point about inequality, although that would be sufficient reason for such discussions. It is a conceptual point to see how connected and disconnected Iran is." Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes, it's working. So, Moslem, thank you very much. This chapter, you haven't read the chapter, right? No, you just, okay. You should. So first, thank you very much for inviting me to read this chapter and to participate here and comment. I have to say for various reasons, this chapter, beyond being just beautifully written and very elegantly argued, it touched on me and my experience in many ways. When, just to give you a couple of examples, and it will lead to my first point, when I grew up in the early 90s, late 80s in Tel Aviv, when you went to the market and you wanted to buy jeans and you wanted to buy Levi's, you knew, if you went to the market, not to the store, you knew to ask the vendor if it was fake or contraband, and the answer would be contraband. What do you take me for? That's one example. In other cases, when my dad was working in the merchant marine, and I remember on the radio, it was before satellite phone, and all ships would basically receive time slots to speak on the radio through a phone to call the families at home. And the kids would tell their parents, because their parents traveled to America also, or to European countries, so they could get the stuff that nobody else had. I remember the moment in the mid-80s when the kids told their parents, and it's funny that I'm wearing this, daddy, don't bring in Converse, give me Reebok. And then the dad wouldn't know what the Reebok was, because but the kid already knew that that's what the thing to bring, because nobody else. And I have various other examples, but just to let you know I mean, I think Moslem did a fantastic job kind of giving a, how do you say, a survey of the various aspects, both of the argument and the kind of the very forceful scenes in the chapter. And the chapter deals, actually, this goes to the first point. The chapter speaks in the language of connectivities, but I think I offer to you to think you're actually talking about relationships that look like connections. And what do I mean by that? The chapter argues about two kinds, as he says here, two scales of connectivities that combined with disconnectivities in that moment since the beginning of the heightening of the sanctions, US led sanctions against Tehran. The first of them is the connectivity or the connections, the connectivity between this and Tehran, which is a kind of center to periphery, as the kolbers say, like with the people who are better than us. So it's let's call it, it's within the nation state hierarchies and the political imaginaries that constitute it, right? And the second one is the as you say, let me read that's the center periphery. The contraband consumer commodities connect the center and periphery in Iran. In this case, Rojhelat, which is home to the marginalized and minoritized Kurds, to the wealthier areas of North Tehran, a place of residence for those whom some of my Kurdish interlocutors referred with the phrase, those who are better than us. And it comes in the chapter, it comes most forcefully when as you heard, the kolber can't buy when your friends from Tehran come to visit you and they go to the nice store, when you can get the how do you say, the fresh produce coming from across the border. The guy who carries them goes next a couple of meters aside and gets the stuff on the floor that is a knockoff. The second kind of the second scale of connectivity is the contraband chase that connect the country's ongoing connections and disconnections with the wider world. So you have, this chapter is basically about the interrelations and changes between two scales of connectivities, center periphery within Iran, and I think you're selling yourself short also between Erbil and Iraq and the other ports, the kind of the regional counterpart of the contraband circuit within Iran, and the other one is the US and Iran, the regimes that cut SWIFT, as you say, that make it impossible for Adidas to keep operating, etc. So the first question, or the first point, and the question to you is the following: you follow Anat Singh in talk about connectivities, but Anat Singh says, and you I think show wonderfully, that it's more about just connectivity, it's about relationships. What do I mean by that? A fact of connectivity is whether something can move or not, whether a road is open, right? But what sustains that connectivity, that fact of being connected, is always, and fantastically you show it in this chapter, relationships. Now, some of these relationships are, let's call them real relationships, the cousins of Aram, for example. But in other cases, the relationship of the more broad definition of, for example, like trust or friendship. And we have many of them. I think the most forceful one, two most forceful ones of them are the ones that having to do with money and the one having to do with trust, with knowledge, right? So when imagine a pair of shoes sitting in a box, just my question, is it sitting in a box or is it like taken out of the box? So it doesn't matter. Right? Imagine a pair of shoes that leaves the factory somewhere or leaves actually a retail center somewhere in Europe, let's say, making its way all the way to Erbil, right? And then it somehow needs to get to the other side of the border. From that moment on, it needs to be carried, right? So if the form of appearance of your story is connection or not, what holds it and what explains it are relationships of various kinds. And I think that the relationships are actually what mediates between those kinds of scales. And it would be related, I think, going to my second point, to the three dimensions, I think, of your story. One dimension is smuggling. And for example, the example of Levi's in Tel Aviv in the late 1990s has to do with smuggling, or if you're lucky, your jeans was smuggled, but it doesn't have to do with sanctions, and it doesn't have to do with, prohibitive economies, okay? So one is smuggling. The second is, let's call it item-related disconnectivities. What do I mean by that? again, back to my youth and in Tel Aviv, before you can eat pork before you could buy pork in the supermarket, if you were in a restaurant and you were a respectable chef and you wanted pork on your menu, you needed to get it somehow. How you get it when non-kosher pork was not, you couldn't find it. You couldn't, according to the law, you couldn't even raise pigs on the land on the Holy Land. You went to the guys who get pork into the country for the consulates and the embassies. So, but in that sense, there is no belligerent economy I mean, there is a nationalist economy here, but it's not belligerent. It's actually, self-defining. So that's the second element. And the third element is, let's call it the space-related, or what you very nicely say in the conclusion, the territorializing related dimensions, which is the case of the belligerence that drives the sanctions economy. And here, I think, getting a Cuban cigar in the United States in the 80s is probably a good example of the kind of things that has to do with an item that you're holding in your hands because you can, right? Item that is defined in its value through this. I think what's nice in the combination of items that you described, and there's a one point in the chapter, when Moslem goes over the kind of the various things. There is alcohol, there's shoes, shows that it is in the interaction between these three dimensions. One of them is the fact of crossing, the fact of getting somewhere to a place in which you shouldn't be. The other one is the item-focused prohibition or prohibitive economy. And the third one is the space one. They all interact, but they interact to produce relationships that then enable or not connectivities. Why is that important? I think because, as you show so nicely, once this connection happens, once you can Adidas needs to, take away its sponsorship, those various forms of relationships kick into action. And they enable then the various ways in which things happen. And I think actually it's not in the end of the chapter, but when you give us the price, that's the most powerful moment, because then it means that it's not that we live in a world in which there is a global economy and things are connected and everything's beautiful, and then there is the backward borderland peripheries way in which people are cousins and you get stuff that is either a knockoff or not. It's that these two worlds are always connected. And that in the world of the fancy shop in the mall, I imagine air-conditioned mall in Tehran, when you can get into a store and get something that's just last year's Adidas or just last year's shoe for a price that, as you say, is a month average beyond a month average salary, what you're paying is exactly the incorporation, on how to say, englobation of the price of the mediation between the relational and the neoclassic, between the informal and the formal. I could go on, but I think that is the main point. The last thing. Is my personal wonder. How do you tell a knockoff from because is it the place? Is it trust? Do you trust the guy in the mall not to sell you knockoff? Because if I don't, I'm revealing the things that I watch, but if you've seen The House of Gucci, do you remember the scene in Lady Gaga when she's in New York and she tells, what's the guy, the tall guy, the guy who plays Adam Driver. She tells Adam Driver, she discovers, she comes out of a subway station in Manhattan, I think in Manhattan, and she sees on the street somebody selling a bag that was just like their flagship bag, and she gets upset and she buys it. And then back in the suite or somewhere, she spreads on the living room floor a bunch of knockoffs, and she shows it to him, and he says, good job, I would have bought that. and she gets upset. So the question is, how do you tell the difference? Thank you very much.
Okay, Alex. So this is a wonderful chapter. I've had the pleasure of, I think, reading the one prior to this. Was it chapter 2? So I'm eagerly awaiting the entire book manuscript because it's very, as I mentioned, a very original set of research. A little secret about Ali and I think whenever it was 12 years ago, I'm dating us now, but whenever we started this series, one of wishes or dreams we had was that we would have events and talks about Iran that were less Tehran-centric. And we were, one of our gripes, even though I wrote a whole book about the Tehran marketplace, was that there is too much of the way that we look at Iran is from the perspective of Iran. And one of the fruits of that is a wonderful autobiography that centers many places outside of Iran, written by Ali. But this paper, in fact, is truly the ideal of what we imagined, is not to decenter Tehran, to erase it, but to actually think about the relationality, Tehran's relations to many other parts of Iran and beyond Iran's borders. So in that sense, it's a kind of a, in some ways, a quintessential ISI sort of project, and you elegantly have pulled it together by taking us to Tehran, to the borderlands, and well beyond, to not only teach us about, for lack of a better term, the sanctions economy that has shaped Iranian society for well over a decade, but also to get us to think about masculinity, to get us to think about imaginations about Iran as a multi-ethnic space, and to think about regions that are actually literally inscribed, that have nothing to do with nation-state boundaries, right? So it's quite powerful and quite rich. So I'm just reading something I wrote here. So what you ultimately are showing us is how this trade is dependent on many things. It's dependent on the economic peripheralization of communities in Kurdistan, the unemployment rates, the lack of economic opportunities, and so forth. But it's also dependent on forms of connectivity across the Iran-Iraq border. It's dependent on disposable income as well as commercial tastes of Tehranis. In the presentation, you didn't get a sense of it, but there's a section in the paper talking about popular culture, music, and these rap videos and the sneakers. You got one slide there, but how actually the taste for Adidas and these things are produced, are manufactured in Iran today, and not just amongst Tehranis, but also beyond. You also show the importance of the acquiescence, if not actual support, of state officials across this value chain, and I'll go back to that in a second. And then finally, the essential role of the ruining of these bodies that bring these goods across the border, and in such and in that last scene where the ruined bodies are actually even they not just whisper, they actually even speak out loud, that silences the audience, is quite powerful. I actually had the exact same kind of reaction to Nawar on this notion of connectivity. I kept, whenever I heard, or the title of the paper is Iran Connected and Disconnected, I guess, with my lens, I kept seeing social relationships, right? So so my instinct too, and my questions, we'll get at this in a second, is that oftentimes, sometimes when you're using the language of connectivity, it becomes mechanistic, it becomes infrastructural and materialistic. And there's definitely materiality of these mountains, all of these things matter, the materiality of these shoes, all of these things matter. So I'm not telling you to expunge all that, but I do, in my reading and my interpretation, there's so much heavy lifting going on in terms of interpersonal relationships. Trust is written all over this, right? Family, kinship, all of these are important factors. So I wonder, as you work through the remaining chapters and work through this chapter, you want to actually ask yourself, to what at what moments is this a story about material connections and bridges? And to what extent is this constitutive of social relations? And once you start thinking in terms of social relations, those social relations are vulnerable to breakage, right? husbands and wives get divorced, people stop talking to each other, people lose trust in one another, and then they have to how do they produce trust? How do they maintain trust? So the reason I like thinking in terms of social relationships, it forces you to think about the making, unmaking, and remaking of those relationships, where connectivity seems, I don't know what the word is, almost too brittle. It's just a one and off. But let me just, because I want to open up the floor to questions. Let me just point, I think I have 4 questions that I think are all go back a little bit to this question of relationality. One question I had is, and it's in there in the paper and your presentation, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about inequalities. So clearly your paper is built around the inequalities or the frictions between Tehran and the village, right? Or the place you're calling the village. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the social inequalities, gender inequalities, the other inequalities within the village or within, let's call it Rojhelat. And because your ethnography does suggest the importance of inequalities. Not everyone has family across the border, right? Some people do. I assume some people are farmers. Some people are property owners. I'm wondering if some people have family in Tehran. Some people have family in, I don't know, Tabriz. I'm just wondering if you can share with us a little bit more about how this trade is built, has maybe exacerbated inequalities within the village, right? And my hunch is that there are what are the consequences for these inequalities? So maybe it's in other chapters, but if you could share with us a little bit of that. And related to that, I know you have a sentence in the paper, I don't think you presented it orally, where you say that the villagers are, manage the boundary between prohibited goods or illicit goods and these illicit goods like sneakers and so forth. So there's a sort of, I guess, guns and drugs and alcohol, and these things don't travel with the same people or the same paths. I'm going to ask you, how do you know that? I know they may say that to you, and I don't deny it. But here, I'm wondering why do you believe them? And even if you believe them, are there other villagers that you didn't talk to that are engaged in those things? And as you know, this is partly my little dabbling in some of this literature, makes me think that especially on the Gulf kind of smuggling, it's intimately woven between the illicit carpets and the illicit heroin and so on and so forth. So in my reading is that these boundaries, maybe they want to keep those boundaries clear, but they do collapse and they blur. So I'm just curious to know why you seem confident that the boundary between illicit and illicit goods is so strong and clear. The third question, I am trained as a political scientist for better or worse, and so may not surprise you, is there's an interesting, you're broaching a really interesting question of what does this all tell us about the Iranian state or the Islamic Republic? And you quote that shop owner or in Tehran saying that they're flying by the seat of their pants. This is the state. This is kind of this improvisational, reactive entity. It's in fact not ideological. It's not dogmatic. It's just like doing things that goes along. I'm sympathetic to that view. I think I've even have an essay that describes the Iranian state as improvisational. But I think at the same time, I have a question, a genuine question. Do you agree with that shopkeeper's description that this is a state that flies by the seat of its pants? Because I hear you in between the lines, just also describing a state with a very clear class project and a set of class alignments, going back to the notion of relationship. I hear you talking about a state that's cultivating a relationship with a particular set of social classes in Tehran and other places. So this is just a genuine question. How do you see the Iranian state now that you've done this research and you're writing it up? Last but not least, I, of course, like many Iranians, probably could not get Mahsa Jina Amini out of my mind reading about this, right? Not because she's Kurdish, but she clearly was, but she was traveling from the border to Tehran, where she was abducted and killed. And so there is her movement along the same sort of pathways. I just could not shake it. And and I'm just wondering if you want to speak to that, or you don't have to, but I couldn't help think of her because we oftentimes think of this enclosed Kurdistan, but it's clearly not enclosed, whether it's the sneakers or whether the cousins or whether it's one way to ask the question, one way to turn it into a question, is Tehran part of Kurdistan? Maybe that's one way to put it. I'm happy to give you a couple minutes to pick up maybe one or two of these threads or questions, or if you prefer, we can go to the audience and maybe some of the audience questions could be folded in, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I can say a few words.
Why don't you say a few words and then you guys can prepare your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I have learned a lot about your work, both, I mean, your work on Central Mediterranean and also your book on the Tehran marketplace. So I have learned a lot from your work. Just a point about sanctions, I wanted to mention here. I'm not sure if I pulled it off, but the point is that they all claim that we had this before the sanctions. So it's not like it all started with the sanctions. They were doing that for a long time. They just, other actors started to kind of take advantage of those relations, and then it was there. But I was shown some photos from, before like 10 years ago, and I couldn't help but notice that it started to become bigger and bigger around 2018, 19. So based on photos and what people told me, it kind of, the sanctions kind of gave it more prominence, but they were there. The question about how do I tell a knockoff from an original one? Okay. I did not know that before doing that. I mean, I was pretty ignorant, as I said. But then after I did my research, I was super, conscious about everything that I was seeing in Europe, for example. I just wanted to know. But sometimes it's easy to say, for example, what Warrior bought from that vendor. I mean, you could tell it was not original. Yes, you could tell. But most of the time, I guess it was, and then when that retailer in Tehran kind of, took offense in what I asked, I realized that maybe I should just trust people. And especially when I was in Kurdistan, I could see stuff coming. Sometimes I would just open them up. I would take photos and then I would just look at it to see if the Nike, logo is actually from this side or the other side. And sometimes, I also bought stuff and then I showed people and they were like, okay, they look good. So I don't know. I mean, but I guess at least in Kurdistan, I could see stuff coming. And then in Tehran, again, like those shops, I mean, they looked like, I mean, the photo that I had from that New Balance shop, everything was written in English. And then it was, I mean, I couldn't believe the prices. It was just, well beyond, a worker's monthly minimum wage. But no, I don't think I can answer that question if I can tell a knockoff from an original one. You gave me a lot to think about. Yes, relationships. I'm gonna just take that and think about it. That is true. Sometimes I'm talking about, relationships. Sometimes it's actually material connections. So I have interwoven all of that together. But you're right. Social inequalities, gender, yes. As I mentioned, it's also a class of, people who have more credit in Kurdistan who started to also take advantage of that job opportunity. And I don't have it yet, but I'm planning on writing about it. How in Kurdistan now everyone's competitor because of the contraband commerce. And then I play with this emic concept of Josh, which means like a Kurdish person who collaborates with the non-Kurdish state, like basically a traitor. And then in the village, everyone is assumed to be a judge, especially if you are a sahiba, if you are working at the border, because in order to get your stuff across the border, everybody assumes that you kind of give something to the guards, or you have good relationships, or you tell if someone is bringing alcohol or other stuff that the Iranian government doesn't want to. So through that concept of judge, I kind of show that maybe, you know, the affinities inside Kurdistan, you know, the relationships that they have, it has also changed. So you have kolbers who are hired, and sometimes they use the phrase, for example, he is my kolber, so he only works with that sahibar, and then that sahibar works with a retailer who has more money, more credit, and most of the time it's a family business. So you have your father working in the same route, and now the son is doing the same. Sometimes you kind of acquire the relationship. You go to Tehran, for example, you get some credit, and then you start your own business, and maybe you make connections. It's not homogeneous, but yes, it has its own, you know, hierarchies in Kurdistan as well. It's not only about, and many people would, I mean, when they theorized it themselves, they would say, okay, these are actually the Kurdish retailers who are taking advantage of us. So never it was, you know, about Tehrani retailers who could actually, you know, have their stores, you know, open in the time of sanctions. And gender inequality, yes, I have a whole chapter on gender. As you know, a group of feminists in the village who are opposed to all that, and they hate the whole contraband commerce and everything like that. And then you have also migration in the village, which is now the alternative to Kulbari. Basically, they are doing the Kulbari job in order to get enough money and ask for more money and just go to the UK. And there is just also a connection between the village and London. So they call it, we have our own neighborhood in London, and everyone from the village is there. And also, you know, different villages around the village, because they speak the same language and they know each other. Yeah, if I take what they say at its face value, so there were like a few people in the village that they kind of never liked me, didn't talk to me, and always avoided me. And everyone was saying that everyone hated them exactly because they were doing business individually. So for example, I showed photos that you see the lights that everyone is going up and down the mountain. And when no one was there, they would start doing the job. And everyone hated them because they said, okay, they are actually, you know, bringing stuff that they would just close the border. So in the previous chapter, I talk about border closures, that it happens exactly because someone starts doing that. For example, it was an incident in I guess it was late February or early March, that I saw like a lot of, you know, vehicles going to the border and just closing the border. And then everyone, like the consensus in the village was that it happens all the time around the same time, that they bring, you know, firework for street celebrations for Charshamba Suri in Iran. And the government doesn't want that for various reasons. And there are a lot of casualties during those days. So that also would lead to border closure. And it happened, and they told me that it happens all the time. And then from the very beginning, they told me, like, they perceived me in the beginning as a journalist. So they thought, okay, I'm just here to know. And they would say, okay, one thing is very important for us, that we don't bring alcohol. And I never saw alcohol. I never saw anything other than cigarettes, cosmetics. I mean, I didn't partake in any of those activities, but I was there, so I could see what comes. I mean, I didn't open all the boxes, and I had, you know, close friends, and I asked about it, and sometimes they would mention a few items that they were kind of unusual, but nothing like, you know, guns or alcohol. And also in the previous chapter, I talk about the fact that they believed that the Iranian government knows what's coming from the other side of the border because of the close connections that it has with the ruling party in the Soleimani governorate, which borders that area. And then they also thought that even, in the Soleimani marketplace, the Iranian government actually does the border guarding from there. And they told me stories, and they would never, for example, go there because they went there for seasonal jobs sometimes. And they wouldn't bring even, alcohol that they sometimes wanted to consume, because they knew if someone would go there and buy alcohol and also guns, because you can buy guns in Soleimani. So they never did that because they thought they would know and they would just catch them. About the Iranian state, I guess I agree with what he said, because what I try to show here about the Iranian state is how contradictory everything seems. I also use this concept that Maziar Qiabi writes about the oxymoronic dimensions of Iranian governmental practices, that nothing seems to, nothing seems to agree with another thing. It just sometimes, for example, I mean, if you want to keep your trade sheet in a balance, you should stop contraband commerce. But why don't you do that? It's like 1/3 of your import comes from contraband commerce. It's not good for your hard currency reserve. It's not good for your, domestic capitalist class. But I couldn't make sense of it other than that, just no plan, no master plan, no idea. It just happens, and everybody favors everybody. I guess, yeah, they are flying by the seat of their pants. I mean, he used a better idiom, but I guess that would catch it much better. So I'm gonna stop here. About Master Gina, I mean, you have in your 5th chapter of your book a concept, affinity across difference. Yeah. So instead of talking about fraternity across Central Mediterranean, you use the metaphor of cousinage, which also kind of shows a bit of unequal footing. So you are related, you are connected, but at the same time you are not equal. You are maybe that cousin who doesn't have enough money, that doesn't have that social standing, but at the same time you're related. I guess what I try to show is that they are being pushed and pulled to the both sides. So yes, they have cousins in Tehran, they have cousinage relation in Tehran, but also they have cousinage relation to the other side of the border. But it's not fraternity, even to the Kurds on the other side of the border, because of the poor treatment. For example, like Rojhelati refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan, they are treated very, very poorly. So, and also, it was never also like a Kurdish nation across the border. I guess the best way to capture the connection between the Iranian Kurds and, folks in Tehran and also to the other side of the border would be that cousinage relationship that you talk about. The same, I guess, goes for Mahsa Jina Amini. She is part of the nation, but at the same time, maybe not an equal part of the nation, like a cousin.
Thank you. We have a few, I should have mentioned that. If those of you are online, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section. We have a few there. I'll turn to them in a moment, but let me see. We have at least, yes, in the back row. Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. My grandpa was actually a kolbers for a brief period of time, so it's helpful. But I had kind of 2 questions. First of all, I wanted to, I'm sorry if you addressed this earlier, but I wanted to know the environmental aspect, what you think about that, both in relation to the impact of this activity on the environment, as well as how the relationship of the people to the environment, the existing environment, kind of helps propel this activity, as well as how the Iranian guards' reactions, including firings of fires, impacts the environment. And the second aspect is related to what you just mentioned. You think there's kind of no master plan behind the Iranian government's inability or unwillingness to stop this activity? And I kind of wanted to hear more about that and push back against it a little bit, especially in the sense of how we think that kind of, how we can reconcile
Yeah, Gabriel, is there, if we collect a few questions? Gabriel?
Thanks, Moslem, for the really wonderful, rich presentation. I wanted to give you or ask you, maybe give you the opportunity to talk a bit more about the relationships between the residents of the village and those on the other side of the border. I mean, you touched on this a bit in your last answer about seeing these two places in relation to one another, and the relationships between the Iranian state and the PUK in Soleimania, but for the residents in the village or for the smugglers, presumably they have to have some kind of relationship with people on the other side of the border. So I wanted to hear a bit about that. And is anything being smuggled out? I mean, it's only really we're hearing about things getting smuggled in. Because I mean, when I was in Basra, obviously a different area of the border, but it was all about Iranian goods being smuggled in. And that's what everyone was freaked out about. It was always kitchenware was being smuggled in. And so, yeah, I wanted to hear a bit about that. And then just a bit about the state. So I guess this is more of a comment, but it's interesting to compare what the situation you're describing with like contemporary Syria, where the Assad regime really depends on smuggling networks for wheat procurement, for instance, and then also the Captagon trade, which is like a huge portion of its revenue. And it's like it's incapable of embarking on the kind of resistance economy or the national self-sufficiency that the Iranian state wants to at least aspire to. So I just think it's an interesting comparison. And then if you could explain a few of the pictures, because I wasn't really following during the presentation. Thanks.
Why don't we give up a lot of good questions there? Why don't we give you a chance to respond?
Okay, yeah, I mean, the shootings, let me start with that one. So when I was there, it didn't happen at all, but I knew it was happening on other routes across Kurdistan. And people were aware of it. Some people didn't believe it. Some people believed it. But then it started to happen later when I left. And they would use rubber bullets, for example. But I know it happens. But why doesn't it happen more often? That's also a question. And I saw scenes where they would just look the other side and they wouldn't bother doing anything. That's why I'm saying they cannot just shoot everyone and kill everyone. It's just too big to stop. And then it also says a lot about the bribes that sometimes they receive. Not all the time they receive bribes. I mean, they could receive it more actually, but sometimes they just stop the flow and ask for 10 loads, for example. And they say, okay, just give us 10 loads and the rest can go, and like hundreds go. And then they go and sell those loads, themselves in the market. That's why I'm saying it's more of a not knowing what to do with the whole thing. And also it's about people's livelihoods. Like imagine hundreds of people are making a living here. And also, as I tried to show, maybe there is also a benefit in just letting some of the items coming into the country. At least you can just, silence your upper classes, that they can get at least some of the things that they want. But you asked about master plan. I don't think they have a master plan, but that's the whole point. I cannot reconcile, different state practices with each other. Again, if you have TVs coming into the country, almost 100% of the TVs, I was told, at least by folks in Tehran, that almost 100% of their products come from contraband routes. So how about your own domestic production if you don't stop that? Something else. Yes, about the environmental aspects. I mean, when you go across the border in different routes, you see the artifacts, like those, burlap sacks that they kind of wrap the boxes, inside it, and they are just everywhere. And it was also, there was this time that someone who was very, outspoken about, environmental issues, and, people shouldn't leave the, when they eat a Coke, they shouldn't just, leave the bottles, in the mountains. Someone needs to go and, pick up all of them. It's bad for the environment. It's just, it's ruining the landscape. And he told me that he did actually actually kolbari for once, decided to do that, and then realized that he just doesn't want to carry that, bottle with him anymore, because he was so tired. He was like, I'm just gonna leave it here. I don't care. And then it also, I wouldn't say it's like garbage or, environmental pollution. I guess it speaks also to the volume of the trade and also inequalities. That's something that people can just pick up and study. It talks about the ruination of those bodies as well. And sometimes when people are, living in the condition of destitute, they would care less about, whether or not they should just pick up, that bottle of, soda that they just drank coming up the mountains, or like the burlap sacks that are just everywhere. I talked about it with them, and that episode when that, environmental activist told me that even he didn't want to do that, that was quite telling. Jason De Leon does something in his book about the artifacts of, migrant bodies across the border, not counting that as garbage and just studying it as the archaeology of, the new history of the present, basically. And that you can see actually what happens through reading those quote unquote garbages. I'm not sure if that's what you were pointing at. That book about Syria, I didn't know about that. I mean, if you could send it my way, that would be great. Smuggling out, I'm not sure if I want to talk about it, because the stuff that goes out is just a bit upsetting, what goes out of the country, and then, makes shortages inside the country. But stuff goes out, but in a smaller volume, really. And you could be in the circuit to know about it. I mean, I came across them a few times, but it's just different. They use cars. They don't use, kolbari actually, because it's just, everyone would be upset the stuff that goes out and make shortages inside the country. The relationship between folks and on the other side, yes, they have relationships, but sometimes when they go there and work there, because that's a thing for seasonal migration to the cities and working there, they're not happy about the way their employers treated them. And then they would talk about it with me and how just they were not on equal footing, and also about the refugees, those who are, in exile in Kurdistan. They are living, for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and especially those who fall under the jurisdiction of, the Erbil government. Still, because they don't have a good relationship with the Iranian government, they can have a better, at least, situation. But because it is believed that, those who are ruling Soleimani are, in good terms with Tehran, they are just under a lot of pressure. That's why you don't have a lot of, Kurdish guerrilla camps inside the Soleimani governorate. Yes.
You want to say a couple words about the images?
Do that. So this is the place. I mean, a good friend of mine who visited me also in the village did those drawings for me. So she did that. It's just when they kind of unload themselves and load the pickup trucks, and then they go through the paved and sometimes unpaved roads of the mountains just to take them to warehouses, and then from there they would distribute them to different cities. And that's the scene almost every day, unless there is a border closure. Other than that, there is a road outside the village. Okay, this map is actually much better. That's me. So for example, in the drawing was from this area, the bazaar. They called it the bazaar when they unload themselves. So they start not from there, but they go to point D with cars, and they go down to the pickup point. They pick it up, come back to the bazaar, unload themselves, and the trucks take it from there. And then that's also the road to the city. I have changed a few. I mean, I asked Ayla to change a few points for me so that I don't, give away the landscape. And that's a photo of you.
Where's the border? Sorry, is it clear?
Oh, there is no border.
Okay.
I mean, you can't tell. I mean, the Iranian government treats the area down the road. I mean, I don't know if you can see the road on the ridge. Exactly, yes. Down there, it's not the border, but the government says no one can go down there, and it's the border. So there's no, there's no line or anything that would demarcate the border. But anything down the ridge is gonna be, yes, anything down the road. What, for example, this is in Kurdistan literature, and that's a shop in Tehran. Yeah.
Okay, we have, there's a question from, it's a whole lot, so, okay. Why don't we we're gonna collect some questions. I'll just go from the front to back, Aisha, and then we'll go back, and then we have a couple questions online too.
Thank you so much. This was so beautifully spoken or written. I didn't read the chapter, but I kind of. So my question is kind of a follow-up from some of the things that you said, but also ask this broader Kurdish geography. Kurdistan, the Iranian part is just a part of it. Of course, we have the Turkish part and the Iraqi part that you mentioned. And the Iranian government's perception of it in relation to Kurdish separatist movements. Of course, what comes to mind as someone from Turkey is the smuggling, Kurdish smugglers in Turkey, and the state's reaction to it based on if they are associated with PKK or not, right? So, of course, PKK is the strongest one in the region in terms of separatism, being the Kurdish separatist movement, but there's also an Iranian equivalent to that, PJAK. And I'm curious how the Iranian state has been making that association, or if it is making that association time to time based on if it is serving it or not. That reminded me of what happened in Roboski in Turkish Kurdistan, where the F-16s bombed 40 Kurdish smugglers, thinking, and then later apologized half-heartedly, saying that the army thought they were terrorists, even though they were smugglers. And this was a very well-used route by smugglers. And also the other thing, there have been discussions about the Turkish government using smugglers as a source of information about what's happening in the region, within and beyond the border, in terms of, again, the separatists. And then based on that, allowing or not allowing, putting more pressure or less pressure in terms of how much they can smuggle, how much they cannot, or when they will be stopped, when they will be allowed to do smuggling.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I missed the early part, so I must be very conscious about my questions. But first, I want to know how systematic the system of kolbers is. For example, where are the links that they are really actually linked to? Are they inside the country, outside the country? And what's the threat and harm for the country? You know, in some levels, they take it so hard in banning the borders. But what's the possible, in your opinion, the possible harm for the country? Okay, so let them import those TVs, shoes, and so on and so forth. I don't know. I still can't understand it. And what are those stops, again, based on what you found? Are they legal or so-called illegal stops? And in what proportion? And also, if you want to compare it in more detail to other regions, either Balochistan or maybe Turkish regions, and what happens there, what would be your description? Thank you.
And yes, in the back row. Oh, this sort of last. I'm just piggyback on sort of these questions. I'm just giving your knowledge. You get the sense that there's like specialization on these different routes. Like I'm just imagining, are they like, where you happen to be in the kind of sneaker center, and like I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Like, when Gabriel was talking about the kitchenware is going to Bashur, like Is it that specialized, or am I overly?
No, it changes actually. And it changed even during my stay. But even that's not the sneaker route. The sneaker route was more to the north. They were not famous for sneakers, but I guess I ended up writing about sneakers because everyone kind of pushed me to write about it. But I wanted to write about cigarettes because more than anything else, that was the cigarette routes. But they took me to uh, so how systematic this is. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. When we asked, I didn't. People were asking questions, weren't on the mic. Sorry.
Sorry, we can.
Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
pass him.
Yeah. I mean, I talked about it. What's the harm? I guess the harm would be really just hard currency out of the country, especially at the time that they cannot, sell their oil. So they need that hard currency. But based on, there is this kind of analysis that they do. They analyze demand inside the country, and then they subtract, domestic production, and also formal trade. Whatever remains is contraband. And the estimates of the economists is that it's like 1/3 of imports are contraband. And if you want to spend, your currency in, I don't know, sneakers or stuff like that, I guess that wouldn't be that, rational in this sense. But that would be the harm, really, just throwing the country's balance sheet off. Licit, illicit, I talked about it, that at least based on my observation, they tended to keep the route free of those items that were like, considered illicit. For example, alcohols, satellite receivers. I saw them, they came, but quite rare, really. With the PKK, I also spent like a month in 2019 in the northern part of Iranian Kurdistan bordering Turkey. I heard that a lot, that they talked about it, that it's actually, they would say sometimes it's kind of is related to PKK, but when I went there to that area of the country, never came up. That was not an issue. And then, I interviewed a few, officers and, commanders, and they said, just, we know where they are. We just want to keep everything, in peace. But I don't think they have that kind of, power in that region, especially. And I went there especially because it was less political and militarized, because it was also not an easy field work to go there. My supervisors kind of made sure that it was not dangerous. That's why I chose to go there, because I knew that they wouldn't, bring stuff like, guns or whatever. And also that it was not militarized. That's why it didn't came up. I can talk more about it, but I don't know how to phrase the whole thing now. So, but it wasn't a big issue, like, Kurdish Peshmerga and how they are connected to the contraband commerce. But then again, going back to the concept of Josh, as I said, it's so in a previous chapter, I talk about this image that all of these people are basically Josh, because you cannot work here unless you kind of feed information to the state people. That is not true, but at least because sometimes some people have the experience of being summoned to the intelligence bureaus and asked to do that, so they can automatically assume that everyone has been summoned, and maybe some people, you know, feed information. So instead of actually doing that, actually having everyone, you know, feeding information to the state people, an image is created that, okay, if you bring something that we don't want, or if you do something that we don't want you to do, there is always something that would tell you, that would just, you know, tell on you. So I guess, I mean, this concept was in Kurdistan before, this concept of Josh, you know, it was basically people who kind of, you know, joined with the state forces against the Kurds, but now it's more into the social, you know, texture of the village, that even, you know, those people who are doing contraband commerce, I mean, the sahib bars, not the kolbers, but the sahib bars and the retailers are Josh, or at least the image is that they are.
We have a couple questions. I just we have a little bit of time, and but actually, I think there's something different from the audience online. Let me just read them one at a time. There's a question: is the contraband is contraband asserting personal freedom and emancipation from the state? Is it an act of resistance towards exclusionary realities in Iran and in the current economic situation? Can you shed some light on the psychosocial underpinnings of contraband activity?
Yeah, I guess that's the question of subversity. Is, you know, unsanctioned crossing of the border a subversive act? So even though they may not, you know, articulate it that way, I guess it is, because in a sense, I mean, the state kind of exerts its power through marking the borders. And if you don't care about the borders and just, you know, disregard the borders, as, I mean, you know, smuggling is disregard for national borders. I guess it's a subversive act, but more than that, it's a question of livelihood, I would say. But some could, you know, read into that the question of subversity as well. What does it tell us when, for example, working even in, you know, on the other side of the border, going for, you know, seasonal jobs, instead of getting a passport and, you know, crossing through the, you know, official ports, you just cross the border, you know, quote unquote, illegally, and work there and come back. That, I guess, speaks to the question of subversity, but not that it was articulated to me a lot.
And let me ask one, maybe there's other questions on the floor, but let me just ask one last question from the online audience. What foreign countries enable the contraband with Iran? In other words, where are the goods smuggled into Iran from? Yeah, maybe, I don't know if you sort of addressed some of that, but.
Yeah, at least in sneakers, I was told that they are doing business from Europe, but sometimes I guess they also did business with Pakistan, that they would just, you know, because there is a big market in Pakistan, that they go and buy those unsold inventories and then just take all of that to Pakistan, and then they distribute it across Asia. Sometimes they told me that they use that, but most of the time they did because they wanted that for themselves in the cities of Iraqi Kurdistan. They also just, you know, relied on that one. But mostly, at least in sneakers from Europe, some of them, I said cigarettes, they were Iranian made. And others from, I mean, mostly European countries. But it's also more than that, because I mean, in Tahlanji smuggling, I mean, Dubai is now a hub that, you know, does all that. A lot of Iranians are there and just, you know, facilitating the business. But I guess the important point, instead of, you know, the goods coming from where, it would be where they are rerouted to. And the point was that they are rerouted to, you know, across the border, and they come to Iran. But yeah, in sneakers, mostly Europe, Germany.
Okay, great. We'll end on that note. please join me in thanking Moslem for a wonderful talk and presentation. And I hope you join us in the Iranian New Year in April, where we will have several more panels. Thank you.